Congratulations, you have made it to the end of the course, and it's been my pleasure to be with you on this journey as you learn about HR practices in the public sector. Now we come to one of the most critical parts of HR, knowing if employees in the HR practices used to develop and manage them are successful. So HR performance assessment and evaluation has long been a controversial topic that usually centers on the appropriate approaches, including the correct and logical measurements and indicators, evaluation targets, reliability, fairness, politics, frequency, and use or lack thereof of performance data for substantive changes and rewards. And as expectations of government performance and accountability change and intensify, assessing the effectiveness of public service workers will also change. So the basics of evaluation and performance assessment starts with measurements and indicators as well as tools and approaches. So it's very important to understand the difference between measurements and indicators. Measurements provide clear, tangible assessment of a construct, concept, physical asset, or person. So for example, the number of cases completed by an employee. Indicators are an interpretation of a construct, concept, physical asset, or work of an employee. So for example, the completion of a large number of cases could indicate a high-performing employee. Tools and approaches. So HR performance tools have become a cottage industry in and of themselves, with an array of pre-formatted and robust platforms that employers can use and customize for their own needs. However, it's really important that the use of tools are carefully planned and are based on analysis of appropriate measurements, indicators, and strategies. So continuing on with basic dimensions of evaluation and performance assessment, it's useful to go through a set of questions, and these are not an exhaustive list, but they are definitely questions that can get you started when you're looking to create a performance and evaluation system, a process, and even auditing your own systems and processes. So it's important to look at the robustness of an HR performance assessment and evaluation process or system. So number one, are enough measurements and indicators being used to provide a comprehensive story not only about the employee, but the organization itself. So for example, it's very important to understand that it's not just employees who have to be looked at, but it's also the impact of policies, processes, procedures, and leadership on the employee that are important to examine as well. Another dimension or guiding question to assess robustness can be are various levels of assessment performed with a particular HR performance assessment. So for example, to what extent are you looking at an individual on their own as opposed to their work on a team? Usage is another bucket that needs to be examined when you're developing the infrastructure and the systems and processes for a performance management system. So key questions include, but are not limited to, the following. Do the intended measurements and indicators provide the necessary and appropriate insight to achieve key organizational goals and public missions? Is performance data used appropriately or at all? Is it used for punishment, reward, improvement, compliance, or all of those things? Is performance data accessible and understandable? Performance systems can become quite complicated and require significant effort as well as infrastructure to maintain. So the question is the infrastructure not only available, but can it be sustained over time? And are there resources to help with the maintenance of a performance system? And then additionally, basic evaluation and performance criteria should look at performance criteria overall. So when we're looking at the criteria to determine to what extent an employee is performing well, you have to first define what is successful. So what is considered a successful or high-performing employee? Who determines that criteria for success or failure? How do criteria align with organizational goals and values? Are criteria assessed in multiple ways, including subjective and objective measurements? And are certain weights assigned to specific criteria? And if so, how are weights determined? So here are direct and indirect dimensions and dynamics related to HR performance assessment. So legislation does play a role in public sector employee assessment. So you can look at the Government Performance and Results Act at the federal level, organizational policies and grant requirements that tie the input of employee activity to outputs and outcomes. There can be a lack of and or transparency of employee actions, such as police officer actions that become the central focus of brutality claims. You can have formal employee reviews of individuals and collective work over time, which is quite common, and we're all familiar, I'm sure, with performance reviews that we go through on our own jobs. And then you have external stakeholder reviews and feedback of employees, and one such stakeholder group would be citizens. So when you're developing a performance assessment infrastructure or system or process, it's important to look at the system, the infrastructure, the process, or the tools themselves. So there are several considerations that are worthwhile to look at. So number one, it's really important to account for the psychological stress of the performance assessment process. There are studies and there's research indicating that the stress of performance assessment can actually be detrimental to employees. And rather than the performance assessment actually being a tool for improvement, it's seen as more as a punitive measure, and it can be quite intimidating and stressful for employees to engage in the process. And therefore, ironically, rather than having the performance assessment give really good and insightful information, it can actually have an effect where it can maybe make the employee not perform as well. But then also it's important to recognize the value of treating people with respect. Therefore, you want to minimize the kind of psychological stress that can be incurred as it relates to performance assessments. Then you have to ask, are the performance assessments, are they reasonable, are they fair, and are they legal? And so do the assessment processes and components, do they comply with policies and agreements? So for instance, is a performance assessment tool or process, does that open you up for discrimination lawsuits? Are they in accordance to, let's say, collective bargaining terms? You want to also determine the extent to which a performance assessment has some degree of transparency and communication. So for instance, it's really important for employees to understand what they're being evaluated on, and for those measurements and criteria and how they're connected to broad organizational goals and objectives, that those are very clear. And so employees understand how their role is connected to those particular goals and objectives, because that will likely be the bedrock or the foundation for determining how successful, how productive they are. Then again, as I mentioned before, you definitely want to take some time to think about if measurements and indicators are logical and if they are appropriate. And you want to consider external factors that could likely impact perhaps traditional measurements and indicators. So for example, as a faculty member at CSU LA, student evaluation reports become part of our review process. And so given the COVID environment and the pandemic, we were given the option, I believe it was last year, to have our student evaluation reports included or not included into one of the upcoming rounds of review. And so it's important, again, not just to look at the measurements and indicators, but also look at the external factors that might be out of your control when it comes to assessing employees. You want to ask if there are sensible and explicit expectations that connect actions and behaviors to goals and objectives. So for instance, are you expecting employees to do things that are perhaps unreasonable, and then putting that into a performance assessment? You want to definitely look for bias. So for example, going back to the faculty example, student evaluation example, it is known, studies have indicated that students can actually be more biased to women and faculty of color when it comes to student evaluation reports. And so you want to see if the tools that you're using or the process that you're using can open the door for a lot of bias. And then you want to ask yourself about the frequency and the timing of performance assessments. So I know that where there are some organizations that might have a once a year assessment, you may want to think about having something that's a little bit more frequent, so then there are no surprises for the employee when it comes time for them to have their formal review. So it's not uncommon to have perhaps maybe informal assessments that lead up to the formal assessment. And another benefit of that is it can possibly reduce the kind of psychological stress that comes when employees have these big formal once-a-year assessments. So given the aforementioned considerations, it is not only important to evaluate employees, but even audit the assessment process and the tools used for performance evaluation. So to end, it's important to recognize that the assessment of public service HR employees, systems, and processes have broad consequences related to public values, welfare, and quality of life. Moreover, public sector HR assessment is not only in the domain of administrators, but also legislatures. So for example, looking at the Government Performance and Results Act, which was actually drafted and passed in Congress. And to a certain degree, the assessment is also kind of in the domain of citizens as well. And so it's important to recognize that HR performance assessment is much more complicated, nuanced, and susceptible to politicization. That is the end of the lecture. Please make sure that you go through this lecture again, as well as the additional learning material, to make sure that things are sticking. And please make sure that you're working towards completing your final case analysis by doing a final check to make sure that you're looking to see how other parts of the course material can be incorporated logically into your work. And also make sure that you're working on your final assignments, which include the rising above activities, the glossary of terms. If you want to do the bonus practitioner interview, please make sure that you're working on that. And also make sure that you do the required discussion board for this module. And you can also, if you wish, do the bonus discussion for this module as well. And as always, if you need assistance, please let me know.